Okay, I think we can start. Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining another JIMENA online event. Today we have a special session with Lyn Julius that will share with us how 3,000 years of Jewish civilization in the Arab world vanished overnight. My name is Sapir and I'm the program director of JIMENA. For those of you who don't know us, JIMENA is an acronym stands for Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa. We're a Jewish nonprofit based in San Francisco, California, and our mission is to raise awareness and share the heritage and history of Jewish refugees from Arab countries, also known as Mizrahim or Sfaradim. There are a few elements to what JIMENA does. The first one is education and community engagement program. We work on college campuses with students, young professionals, and adults. We have a curriculum for Jewish Day School and Arabic outreach program. Another element is advocacy, pursuing legislation in order to protect the property and rights of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. Throughout the special time, the quarantine period, we host a lot of community engagement and other online programs. You can find all our offerings online at jimena.org. And if you missed any of them and you would like to see them, you can go to our Facebook page. All the lectures are recorded and showing there. Just to let you guys know, this session will also be recorded and will show on our Facebook. So if you guys don't want your face to be seen, you can turn off your video, although we would love to see all of your faces. That's nicer on a Zoom event that we can see the participant and engage better. So with us today, I think I'll just go ahead and introduce Lyn. Lyn is our speaker for today. She's a British-born daughter of Iraqi-Jewish refugees, a journalist and a blogger, and also the founder of Harif, the UK Association of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Her work has appeared in the Jerusalem Post, the Haaretz, Huffington Post, the Guardian, Times of Israel, and many, many more. And today she's gonna share with us some insights from her book, and also gonna blow up some myths about Jews from Arab countries. She prepared a really special presentation that I had a minute to look at, and I'm sure we're gonna have a wonderful session with her. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat below, and she will address them at the end of the session.
Well, thank you very much, Sapir. I am really honored to be invited by JIMENA to talk about my book. Can you all hear me? Yeah?
Yes, we can.
That's good. Okay, so yes, my book, Uprooted, which came out about in 2018, and actually now exists in Norwegian, of all languages. I'm hoping that it'll soon be translated into Arabic and maybe even into Hebrew. My organization, Harif, as Sapir mentioned, does a similar sort of job to JIMENA. We are based in England, but I've always been an admirer of JIMENA's work. And on occasion I've met Gina Waldman, the founder of JIMENA, and she's done fantastic work. Sarah Levin has done fantastic work. Sapir's doing wonderful work. So congratulations to you all, and may you all go from strength to strength. So we do a similar sort of job, as I say, but we have 5 volunteers. So we don't have a lot of funds either, but like JIMENA, we've gone online during this coronavirus period. And I must say, there is a positive side to this because it has opened up a whole new world. It has brought us to a whole new audience. And we've even managed to have speakers from outside the UK without having to pay their airfares and hotel accommodation, which is all good. So to go back to my book, as Sapir mentioned, I am the daughter of Iraqi Jewish refugees. I set up Harif about 15 years ago because I felt there wasn't really much awareness of the story of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries, and that we needed to raise awareness of the history, culture, and narrative of all these people who actually had left the Arab world and were never going to come back. And when I say Arab world, I mean the Middle East and North Africa, because we also cover Iran and Turkey and non-Arab countries too. And so 15 years ago, I started Harif. We mainly do lectures and talks and film screenings. But about the same time, I also started a blog called Point of No Return, which some of you may be familiar with. And I have actually posted about 5,000 articles. If you just Google Point of No Return blog, you get to it. And this is a collection of different things I found online, articles and reviews and all sorts of, articles, links to articles. And I was trying to collect information really and build up an archive on this subject. So the book Uprooted actually grew out of Point of No Return and aims to draw certain common themes together. And the result is this book, which hopefully some of you may have read. And hopefully some of you will order your copy soon. So the central focus is actually the ethnic cleansing of 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries. I touch on the Jewish exodus from Iran, but it isn't my central concern, the Jews who were forced out of Arab countries, and this occurred from about 1948. And the exodus from Iran only took place in 1979 when the Ayatollahs took over. But of course, that was also a mass exodus, and the Jewish population of Iran is down by about 4/5 of its original number. Now, I myself, when I was growing up, even though I was born in Britain, I was sort of haunted by the story of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries, because I still had relatives living in Iraq. I had my 4 grandparents, and I had several cousins and aunts and uncles. In 1967, as you know, we had the 6-Day War. This was a terrible disaster for Arab countries. And the regime in Iraq took its revenge on the 3,000 or so Jews still living in Iraq. This was the remnant of a community that had once numbered about 150,000. But in the early 1950s, 90% of the community had actually left to go to Israel. Now, my relatives were stuck in Iraq at the time as the regime took its revenge on them and cut off their phones and froze their bank accounts, backed them from their jobs, stopped them from studying at university. They became hostages in the country. And the worst period came in 1969 when 9 Jews were hanged in Liberation Square in Baghdad. And you can imagine the terror that this small community was going through. And these hangings were only just the beginning. It's often forgotten that about 50 Jews disappeared in the. My remaining relatives managed to get out. Some of them were smuggled out illegally through the north of Iraq, disguised as Arabs, and over the border into Iran, which was then a friendly country. It seems amazing to think that now. This was really a story that had really haunted me, and has really, and this is why I think I am so interested in this subject of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. So the Jewish population in Arab countries actually went down more dramatically than even the Jewish population in Europe at the time of World War II. Although obviously the results were not nearly as tragic, and most of the Jews who did survive, most of the Jews did survive Exodus. But just to have a closer look at the figures, you can see in 1948, communities which had hundreds of thousands of Jews, now you can count them on the fingers of one or two hands. And there are certain countries which actually have no Jews at all. For instance, Algeria, Libya. In Egypt, for instance, there are, I think, about 10 Jews, mainly elderly ladies. In Iraq, there are only 5 Jews. The only functioning communities really are in Morocco and Tunisia. In Iran, I've included Iran. There are still functioning synagogues, but the community is really a fraction of what it used to be. The other thing you notice about this chart is how very old these communities were, and they go back to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries before the Christian era. In fact, they go back to biblical times. The community in Iraq, for instance, is known as the Babylonian community. At Or Yehuda in Israel is known as the Museum of Babylonian, the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center. They don't talk about Iraq because that's a modern name. And the Jews who actually populated, settled in Iraq, present-day Iraq, go back to the captivity of the the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon, and most of the community was in continuous residence in that part of the world up until about 70 years ago. Now, the region has always had almost as much Jewish history as the land of Israel itself. For instance, there were about 17 biblical figures buried in the region, and 5 biblical prophets. And one of these prophets was Ezekiel. And Ezekiel's tomb is about 2 hours drive down south of Baghdad in Iraq, and used to be a very popular place of pilgrimage for the Jews of Iraq when they lived there. And about 5,000 Jews would visit Ezekiel's tomb around the time of Shavuot, which is coming up soon. And on the picture on the left, you can see the scribes who would stand outside the shrine, and they would write down prayers and blessings for the visiting pilgrims. And on the right of your screen, you can see a detail from some of the Hebrew inscriptions that decorated the burial chamber of Ezekiel's tomb. But if you look at it now, this is what it looks like. It is almost unrecognizable it's been turned into a Shiite shrine. And the original tomb of Ezekiel is just a very small part of this mosque. And if a Jew wanted to visit the shrine of Ezekiel today, he wouldn't be allowed in because Jews are not allowed into mosques. And certainly in the Shia, according to Shia tradition, the Jews are actually unclean, and they wouldn't be allowed to defile such a place as this mosque. So this has only happened actually in the last few that this mosque has actually been built. We do know that the original shrine is actually intact. In other words, the Hebrew inscriptions are still there, but we don't know for how much longer. And certainly the character of the place has been changed beyond recognition. And this is really what's happened to Jewish heritage across the Middle East. It's either been converted to other purposes, and synagogues have been converted into mosques, or boxing rings, or clubs, or they've been allowed to really crumble to dust. And there've been roads built across Jewish cemeteries. There've been, and therefore the whole Jewish heritage and Jewish heritage sites have been erased, as if Jews never lived in this region. The one exception there really is Morocco, where the king has actually invested quite a lot of money in restoring Jewish sites, synagogues, preserving cemeteries, and Jewish quarters. Now, let's look at what the relationship between Jews and Muslims was during the 14th centuries that they lived together. I mean, there is this myth that Jews lived in peace and harmony, you know, in that time, during those 14 centuries. But that presupposes a sort of equality of relationship between Jews and Muslims, which didn't actually exist. And when we talk about coexistence, what we really mean is symbiosis. Because the Jews were there for such a very long time, it influenced the environment around them, and the environment in turn influenced them. And as we know, Islam is very close to Judaism, and Arabic is very close to Hebrew. And there was this symbiosis that didn't exist in the Christian world. But the relationship between the Jews and the Muslims was not equal. The Jews and the Christians were actually dhimmi, which means that under Sharia law, they were inferior to the Muslims because they hadn't accepted the final revelation. They were allowed to practice their religion, but they were always under pressure to convert, and certainly being a dhimmi, they had to pay a special tax. And that tax was really a way of buying the protection of the ruler, because they were not allowed to protect themselves. So it was a bit like paying protection money to the mafia. The dhimmi also had to abide by certain humiliations and restrictions, and really had very few rights. Sometimes the dhimmi situation was good, sometimes it was very good, depending on the ruler, and other times it was terrible. So it was always precarious. I won't read you all this passage, but Jews in Morocco, for instance, were known as, were given certain necessary economic functions like money lending and associated tasks like metalworking, which were deemed reprehensible or unlucky by the non-Jewish majority. And the Jews were also given the most menial of tasks. For instance, salting of decapitated heads in Morocco. And in Yemen, the job of cleaning the sewers was done by a subcaste of Jews. And in Egypt today, the Copts, the Christian Copts, are the rubbish collectors. And in 20th century Iraq, the Christians also did menial jobs like cleaning septic tanks. Of course, Jews performed an essential function as commercial go-betweens and could and did rise to lofty positions as courtiers, sarafs, that's treasurers, and merchants. Some were fabulously rich, like Hayim Fahi, but like him, these Jews could just as quickly fall into disfavor. Fahi had his nose cut off and his eye gouged out by a treacherous Ottoman governor and was subsequently assassinated. So you can see that the dhimmi situation was always precarious, and the dhimmis were always at the mercy of the ruler of the day. Now, all this changed quite dramatically in the 19th century. In fact, there was a complete revolution. What happened was the Western powers increased their influence in the Ottoman Empire and began to insist on the abrogation of the dhimmi rules. And therefore the dhimmis became equal to the Muslims. And they began to enjoy equal rights. And about the same time, a group of well-meaning French Jews set up a network of schools called the Alliance Israélite Universelle, more than 200 schools. And this actually brought education to the Jewish communities of the Muslim world and equipped them with the skills and languages to prosper in the modern world. And it was very successful that the Jews actually became a middle class and began to contribute to their societies and ended up getting almost the best jobs. And the Muslims were being left behind during the colonial era. And this actually, I believe, is a factor that explains some of the tension that you get between Arabs and Israelis today. You know, that an inferior people were no longer acting as inferior at all. In fact, they were acting as superior when they should have been dhimmis who knew their place. So the European colonial era was actually a very short era. It only lasted during the first decades of the 20th century. But Jews found it was a golden age for the Jews. And they had servants, they had nice houses, there was a middle class, they had good jobs in the colonial administrations, in the British mandates and the French protectorates. And they also excelled in lots of fields, for instance, finance, trade, commerce, banking. And they were also prominent in the arts. It was a cultural golden age. And here are some examples of musicians and singers who were famous and still are famous in the Arab world. And I actually have on the front cover of my book, you can see here, this is an Egyptian actress called Camelia. Her real name was Lillian Levy Cohen. And she was very young when she was discovered. She made about 18 films in the course of 3 years, but sadly, she died in a plane crash. And rumor has it that she was actually killed by King Farouk because she was his mistress, and it was convenient for her not to be on the scene. But that's probably just a conspiracy theory. There were musicians in Iraq who were almost all Jews. In fact, the Iraq radio orchestra in Iraq had only 3 Muslims and 250 Jews. And the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, their music is still famous in the Arab world. But all this came to an end, really, with the rise of anti-Semitism. The first type of anti-Semitism actually was colonial anti-Semitism, because even though the Jews were very useful to the colonial powers, and the colonial powers were very happy to exploit their talents and their languages and their skills, they were not fully accepted, except in Algeria, where the Jews actually attained French citizenship. The colonial powers did not give British or French citizenship to the Jews. And in fact, Algeria, even though the Jews did have French citizenship there, it was also a hotbed of anti-Semitism. And here you see a pamphlet that was produced by Edouard Drumont, who was actually the representative in the French Parliament of Algiers. And there was a great deal of anti-Semitism among the white colonial settlers in Algeria. The Algerians liberated the Jews from the dhimmi status. They gave them equal rights. But of course, they ultimately betrayed the Jews, and the Vichy governments during the war, there were pro-Nazi governments set up in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia, and they began to implement the first stages of the final solution. And the colonial powers were actually not always prepared to protect the Jews at times of trouble. For instance, you only have to look at what happened during the Farhud, which was the massacre of 1st and 2nd of June 1941. The British army were actually at the gates of Baghdad and could have easily stopped the killing, but they didn't. There was another type of anti-Semitism that arose in the early 20th century, and that was the anti-Semitism associated with Arab nationalism. There were many movements in Arab countries that actually wanted their independence from the colonial powers, but they had a blood and soil concept of nationalism that actually excluded minorities and discriminated against them, and ultimately ushered them towards the exit. And some of these parties were actually built on fascist lines and influenced by the Nazis. And this symbol here you see might remind you of another symbol we know. It's the symbol of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And that party actually still exists today in Syria. And of course, there was the Ba'ath Party, which also still exists today. Another form of anti-Semitism that arose at this time was Islamist anti-Semitism. We hear a lot about Islamists, about ISIL or Daesh, about Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, etc., etc. And of course, Hamas is the Gaza branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. But the granddaddy of them all was the Muslim Brotherhood, which actually was founded in 1928 in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna, and he's the figure in the fez in the center. Now, anti-Semitism was at the very core of the Muslim Brotherhood's philosophy, not just because things were hotting up in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, but because Jews represented modernity. They represented minority rights and women's rights and civil rights. And this is something that the Muslim Brotherhood abhorred. They wanted to turn the clock back and re-establish the dhimmi status under Sharia law. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood actually incited a lot of hatred in Egypt, And riots, in fact, broke out against Jews and Copts in the 1930s, well before the creation of Israel. Now, the Germans were represented in the Middle East. You've got Fritz Grobber, who was the German ambassador to Baghdad throughout the 1930s, and he was intriguing against the British. He translated a lot of Nazi propaganda. You see Mein Kampf here, which was translated and serialized in Arabic. What they wanted to do was mobilize the Arabs against the British and the French. Now, the third party to this alliance was none other than the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. Now, Haj Amin al-Husseini, people often say that he was anti the Jews because he wanted to fight the British, and this was a pragmatic alliance against the British. But in fact, I would argue that he was an ideological anti-Semite, and from the very first, he was against Jews, not just Zionists. And in fact, wherever he went in the Arab world, he incited hatred against the Jews. And of course, that culminated in the Farhud massacre I mentioned earlier. He fled Iraq at the time, having been there for 2 years. He fled Iraq. He ended up in Berlin as a guest of Hitler and spent the rest of the war there, broadcasting virulent anti-Jewish propaganda. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. He didn't say kill the Zionists, he said kill the Jews. And this is a picture of his famous meeting with Hitler in November 1941. And the purpose of this meeting was really to ask Hitler's permission for the Mufti to manage the extermination of the Jews throughout the Middle East and North Africa. And that was going to happen regardless of whether the British were beaten and the French were beaten. He was going to carry out this operation himself. That would be his life's work. He also set up Muslim SS divisions in the former Yugoslavia. And here you see the soldiers of the SS units in Albania and in Bosnia at prayer. There is a myth that the Holocaust did not affect Jews in North Africa and the Middle East, but of course that is a myth. In fact, Tunisia came under 6 months of direct Nazi control in 1942. And here you see in the top picture, Jews being marched off to labor camps. In the bottom picture, you see Jews who were actually deported to Bergen-Belsen. They were Jews of British nationality. About 800 of them were deported. Most of them did survive. And these lucky Jews you see coming back after the war to Tripoli in the railway carriage, they survived, as you can see. But there were many Jews in Libya who actually died. There was a terrible concentration camp called Jado near Tripoli, and about 600 Jews died of starvation and typhus. There were even labor camps in Morocco, and the inmates there were meant to be building the Trans-Sahara Railway. So, and there were Jews in those camps. Okay, so the big question, one of the big myths that we come across quite a lot is that there was no anti-Semitism before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. But of course, this is an absolute myth. Jews were the victims of outbreaks of violence, riots and pogroms. This is a picture of the Fez pogrom of 1912, in which 45 Jews were killed. And you only have to look at the way that minorities in general have been treated in the Middle East, for instance, Copts and Yazidis and Assyrian Christians, to know that, and these minorities who had no Israel of their own have been persecuted. So it's not just a problem with the Jews. I would say there's a dysfunction in Arab Muslim society that means that anyone who is different cannot be tolerated. And I think this is really the underlying cause of the conflict in the Middle East today. So fast forward to 1948, Israel is declared, Israel is established, 7 Arab League countries declare war against it, and at the same time they declare a second war against their own Jewish populations. So they bring in state-sanctioned persecution, they strip them of their citizenship, they dispossess them of their property, they freeze their bank accounts, they kick them out of their jobs. Pressure builds up amongst the Jews to leave these countries. The backdrop of all this persecution is actually violence. Violent riots break out across the Arab world. Eventually, Zionism becomes a crime. But of course, how do you define Zionism? Is wearing a talit, Zionist, is being in possession of a letter from Palestine, is that Zionism? And of course, the two became completely conflated, Zionism and Judaism. The Jewish population were desperate to leave, but they were hostages. Eventually, the Iraqi government and some other governments allowed their Jews to leave, but the penalty was that they would be stripped of their rights. For instance, in Iraq, the Iraqi Jews who wanted to leave were allowed to leave in 1950, but they were issued with this laissez-passer, which says, if you look at those of you who read Arabic, if you look at the stamp on the left-hand side, it says, one way, no return. So they're actually kicked out. And this was also accompanied by mass dispossession. These Jews who were refugees by any definition were not allowed to take anything with them, maybe one suitcase and 20 dinars in their pockets. Now, some Jews were extremely wealthy. I'm thinking of Jews in Egypt who lived in mansions. For instance, the Zuckerman family who lived in Cairo, and their residence has been turned into an embassy today. And in fact, you find that that the Pakistani, the Dutch, the Canadian, the Korean, all these embassies are former Jewish residences. It's absolutely astonishing. Of course, they've never been compensated for this. So what happened to these Jews? Well, the vast majority went to Israel. 650,000 out of 850,000. The rest went to Europe, to America, to Canada, Australia, South America. But Israel only had 600,000 Jews living there at the time, and so the influx of Jewish refugees from Arab countries actually doubled the population virtually overnight. Israel was a very poor developing country at the time and didn't have the resources to take care of these people, and it didn't have the jobs. It certainly didn't have the housing. And so these Jews were put into tent camps or ma'barot. And some of these tent camps endured for up to 13 years. And I have in my book a picture of an invitation to a wedding actually took place in a hut. And it says, it says to the guests, please come to such and such a wedding on such and such a date in hut number 10 of this Ma'abara. And of course, things were extremely difficult for the refugees. They had, a hard time in the 1950s, 1960s, but I think you can now say that the absorption was successful, and Mizrahim are now represented in every walk of life and have held every position in government except for Prime Minister. But of course, their story has not been told, and there are various reasons why. But this artwork by an artist called Gergal shows you how few pages in a school textbook were actually devoted to teaching the history and heritage of Jews from Arab countries. In the last few years, this has begun to change. The school curriculum in Israel is supposed to be including more information on Jews from Arab countries and Jews from the Middle East, and things are changing slowly. In addition, we have a Memorial Day, which I know JIMENA, you celebrate a whole month, Mizrahi Heritage Month. We celebrate the 30th of November. We commemorate the Exodus, and this has actually gone some way to raising awareness of the whole issue of Jewish refugees. But there's still a long way to go. Before I conclude, I would just like to leave you with this thought, and that is, we're accustomed to thinking of this region as the Arab world, but it isn't the Arab world, and Arabs don't have exclusive political rights. There is a whole rich tapestry of ethnic groups and religions and sects, and some of them have been clamoring for self-determination really since the end of World War I. And some of them were promised self-determination, for instance, the Assyrian Christians and the Kurds. And the Jews really are the only indigenous people to actually have achieved, the only non-Muslim indigenous people to have achieved self-determination. And I think the lesson one can learn from that is that in order to survive as a non-Muslim indigenous people in the Middle East, you need your own state and the power to defend it. And so I will just leave you with that thought. Very happy to answer questions. Over to you.
Why don't you just talk about your future
Okay,
events?
all right. So just before I answer any questions, just want to leave you with the notice of future events that we're having. I mentioned the Memorial Day for Jewish refugees. We've got an event with Ashley Perry, who's actually the architect of this Memorial Day, on Tuesday, next Tuesday. Please subscribe to the Harif website in order to get more information. And there are other talks as well. And if you'd like to buy my book, it's available on Amazon. And I think for the princely sum of $19.
We'll make sure to have a link in the chat down below with to the book, and I can also send it to all the participants after with the
Thank you very much.
website and everything else.
Lovely. Okay. So are there any questions?
I think we have a lot of questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, I see. Right. Okay. I'll just take a minute. Oh, that's very kind, Sarah. Sarah's given me a plug. Point of No Return blog is the best source of news related to Jews from Arab countries. Thank you very much. I try and update it every day, except Shabbat. So Ronnie Dalal asks, not sure, but is there anecdotal evidence that Jews were conscripted during World War I? Which Jews are we talking about here? Certainly Jews in Algeria served in the army. Jews in Iraq, for instance, were forced to join the Ottoman army, some of them by force. What else?
On above it, you forgot the first question.
Yeah.
Ottoman time.
In Ottoman times, weren't only Muslims allowed in the military? Jews paid the tax. That's correct. All that changed sort of towards the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and Jews actually were prepared to go into the army. But when the Ottomans found themselves, at war with the colonial powers, I think the Jews were really not so happy to be drafted into the army at that stage. Victor says he's read that in the middle of the 19th century, the head of the empire, forgot his title, realized that to be Muslim, Jews must be equal and no more taxed and can be drafted. Yes, that is absolutely right. Let's see. From Victor, aren't the people in the Middle East and North Africa? Sorry. Were there no less fortunate Jews in that period? Again, I'm not quite sure what you mean. No less fortunate. Sorry, these are more comments than questions.
Someone asked if you're planning to do a movie based on your book.
Well,
it would be wonderful. Can anybody finance it?
Yes, $50,000 would be very nice.
Lawrence says $50,000 would be very nice. I would love, I know you're in LA. Maybe you have good contacts in the film industry. I would love to turn it into a film.
Lynn, this is Sarah. I'm chiming in with my audio. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sarah.
Okay, I just want to help moderate a little bit. So one of the questions says, what is the likelihood of Jews from Arab countries ever being compensated for what they lost?
Yeah, well, that is the question, isn't it? There was a study done by the ministry in Israel that's responsible for Jews, Jewish refugees, and the figure of $150 billion, I think, was produced by this study, although it hasn't been officially released yet. And that is, a massive amount. Do I think it's likely that they'll ever get compensation? Well, it's possible that there may be an international fund set up for all refugees who lost property in the Middle East. That includes Palestinians. But obviously we're not there yet. But it would be, it is necessary, I think, to have compensation on the table. It's certainly one of the requirements under Israeli law is that no peace agreement should be signed unless there's compensation for Jewish refugees. So we'll see. We're nowhere near there at the moment, but it is on the agenda.
So this is a question that's related to that. So are you aware of any contemporary conversations from multi-religious groups on desires to protect Jewish historic sites throughout the Middle East and North Africa?
You're saying, are there any...
Are there any efforts to protect sites, Jewish sites in Arab countries? And I guess what's the involvement of other religious groups, ideally multiple religious groups?
I can't speak for the other religious groups. I know there are groups that are very interested in Jewish heritage. I'm not sure they can do an awful lot. For instance, I gave you the example of Ezekiel's tomb that only recently was turned into a mosque. There was not a peep from the international community about this, and certainly no Jewish organizations raised any objections, even though, you know, I was running a petition from about 2010 onwards, do not, you know, save Ezekiel's tomb. Of course, nobody took any notice of that. I think what you're doing is very important, you know, in terms of saving movable Jewish heritage, you know, and stopping the US government from signing a memoranda of understanding with various Arab governments that would allow them to lay their hands on Torah scrolls and documents and whatever that actually belong to the Jewish community. You know, I think this is probably as much as we can do at the moment, you know, but we have very little influence in the Arab countries themselves, you know, and there's not a lot we can do as Jews to save Jewish sites. And it's certainly not on anyone's agenda, unfortunately.
Another question. Did Jews ever have full citizenship or full equality in the Middle East and North Africa?
Well, they certainly did have French citizenship in Algeria, but Algeria was sort of part of metropolitan France. So there were Jews who had foreign citizenship. For instance, about 25% had, in Egypt, had French, Italian, Greek, or British citizenship. And in fact, there were small numbers of Jews in Tunisia and Morocco who also had foreign citizenship. So yes, the answer is they did. There were other countries in Iraq where there were hardly any Jews who had foreign citizenship.
I'm just reading through the questions. There's a lot of comments.
Yeah, I know there's a comment saying the Egyptian government renovated the Eliyahu HaNavi synagogue. Yes, they certainly did. They did a very good job. The Eliyahu HaNavi synagogue is the largest in the Middle East, absolutely wonderful Italianate building built in the 19th century. And we know why the Egyptian government did this. Forgive my cynicism, but it is really to attract tourists. And there are no Jews left practically in Egypt. There will never be services in that synagogue. It'll just be an empty building. And this, unfortunately, I think these Arab governments actually do cash in on Jewish heritage, really, in order to attract tourism. But there is no attempt to, you know, to make the climate more favorable towards Jews. You know, in other words, Jews will not feel safer or able to flourish in these countries. And unfortunately, you know, Jewish life has virtually come to an end in most of them.
So I feel very conflicted about the restoration of synagogues. So given what you just said, do you believe that the synagogues should be restored or not?
Yeah, I'm conflicted as well, because I think it is better for them to be restored than not. But of course, it is a PR exercise for the government concerned, and it plays very well. A lot of Jews are very happy to see their Jews. I see you nodding. I mean, you're shaking your head.
No, I'm listening.
Yeah, not you, not you.
Oh,
So no, I think it is better for the heritage to be preserved, but let's not kid ourselves. These are our empty buildings, and you know they. Yeah, that's all I can say, really.
yeah. So someone mentioned in Morocco, many Jewish sites are being renovated. There's also tours, Jewish tours of Morocco that happen all the time, and there's still a small Jewish community that lives in Morocco. And Morocco is sort of held as a beacon of coexistence and tolerance. Do you want to talk a little bit about Morocco?
Yeah. Well, I actually gave a talk, an online talk, a couple of weeks ago about the Jews of Morocco. Yeah. That is absolutely true. Everything you say is true. He's restored, the king has restored a lot of Jewish sites, and there is a Jewish community, but it's only 2,500 people, and it's really on its last legs. I would say that subsequent generations, you know, they're leaving Morocco. There isn't a very bright future for the Jewish community in Morocco. And if the king is deposed, then, you know, all this will end anyway. And that's the trouble, you know, that it's not a democracy, Morocco. There have been attempts to depose the king in the 1970s, and, you know, anything can happen. What can I say about, what more can I say? I mean, we need to give credit to the King of Morocco because he's actually been quite bold in what he's done. He's tried to sort of normalize things as much as possible with Israel. Israeli tourists are welcomed in Morocco, and the Jewish community of Morocco does lead quite a Jewish life there, but they are 1%. Let's not forget 1% of the former Jewish population of Morocco. You know, and it's almost nothing now.
Can I interrupt for a second? You also see that it's taken, 2 months for the Israelis to be able to leave Morocco who've got coronavirus because of the barriers put in their way. So it's not plain sailing. If they were Americans or Europeans, they wouldn't have been delayed for 2 months.
Yeah,
and he didn't allow direct flights to Israel either.
That's my husband, by the way.
Yeah. So this is another more personal question, but it's related to this, to I think all Jews from Arab countries who traveled and who lived in multiple countries that, you know, I think we think of like Egyptian Jews as being Egyptian, and yes, there are many Egyptian Jews, but there are also Iraqi Jews who went into Egypt, Turkish Jews. So it says, how did your family get to England? How active are Iraqi Jews there? So if you could talk a little bit about Baghdadi Jews and Jews who went into India and the Far East and other places in Africa.
Yeah.
And also your story too, your family story.
Yeah, well, my story. How did my family end up in England? Well, they are a very small minority of Iraqi Jews who did end up in England. I'm not quite sure how many Iraqi Jews there are in England, actually. Maybe about 10,000, something like that, or fewer. What's interesting about Iraqi Jews is that in the 19th century, some of them moved east to India and the Far East, and they set up communities in Bombay, in Calcutta, even in Pakistan, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, Burma, Indonesia. And these are all basically Iraqi Jewish communities.
And Sudan. I just want to throw that in.
Sudan, that's right. You listened to our talk there. Sudan was really an extension of Egypt, and both were under British colonial rule. But it's very interesting. They were very enterprising, the Iraqi Jews, and they did set up these trading posts and very successful communities. But of course, very little is left of these now. I mean, they didn't leave out of anti-Semitism necessarily. But there isn't much left. Like, for instance, in India, I think there are only about 30 Iraqi Jews left in Bombay. there are still B'nai Israel, which is the kind of original Jewish community of India. There are still about 5,000 of them. But all these Iraqi Jewish communities, if you call them that, are really coming to an end.
If we give a little anecdotal story, we were talking up in the north of Scotland about 2 years ago, and there was a family there called Sassoon. They'd been sent to this town called Dumfries, which at the time was the third biggest port in Scotland, in 1820s as part of the Sassoon trading empire, and they're still there today.
Yeah, that's my husband Lawrence. Yeah, it's amazing to think the Sassoon family ended up, you know, in the northern part of Scotland, as well as, you know, founding the community in Bombay and elsewhere. So I don't know if that answers that.
Yeah, so I think our time is just about up, right? This is 1 hour talk.
Yes.
Great.
I'm happy to answer more questions if you like, or if you want to write to me, email Harif.
Lyn, do you want to type in your email address and any other information in the bottom of the chat box so people can contact you?
I can do that. I think the best thing is info@harif.org, and that will get to me.
I can type it in.
Yeah.
And I'll put in JIMENA's email as well. Okay, I'm going to step back. It's really finished.
Okay, Lyn, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I think you touched on a lot of, like you said, you're going to blow up some myths and talk about subject that people really don't know about. And I really appreciate you joining the session and doing this. We got to make sure that everyone get the information. I'm also going to send the participant the link to the Harif website and JIMENA website after the session. Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. And
thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.